What is something that was once considered to be a legend or myth that eventually turned out to be true? It was widely regarded to be a myth that the first emperor of a united China, Qin Shi Huang, built a massive replica of his empire as his mausoleum. The stories said he had thousands of statues of soldiers constructed to guard his empire in the afterlife and had an underground palace with rivers of mercury. In 1974, more than 8,000 terracotta warriors were uncovered in Xi'an, China. Gorillas. Before they were documented, they only existed in stories for a long time. Imagine finding a giant squid getting washed up on shore before anyone knew what they were. Had to be so terrifying. Well, not quite a perfect fit, but the one that always sticks in my mind was that the Mongolians would always boil their water before drinking to get rid of the tiny evil spirits. That's a pretty good description of germs and bacteria for the time period. The Black Swan. It used to be used as a phrase to mean something that was impossible to exist, or an affront to nature. Then they sailed into the Swan River in Western Australia. And lo and behold, there they were. Mountaineers found a small lake in the Himalayas, absolutely covered in bones. As they searched, they found the bodies of at least 200. As well as potentially up to 3 times that many in the lake itself. All of them died of blunt force trauma from what appeared to be a rock slide. But there was no sign of any such rocks. Raja Jastival, the king of Kannauj, was traveling with his pregnant wife, Rani Palampa. They were accompanied by servants, a dance troupe, and others as they traveled on a pilgrimage to Nanda Devi shrine. For the Nanda Devi Rajjat, which takes place every 12 years. As they traveled, they were overcome by a sudden, severe hailstorm with extremely large hailstones. The storm was too strong, and with nowhere to take shelter, the entire group perished. It was long thought to be a legend, but now they think it actually happened. Almost exactly the way it was said to have happened. I believe there exists an oral history of a tremendous wave striking the Pacific Northwest among various coastal tribes. It was broadly viewed as being nonsense before they uncovered evidence of a colossal thrust earthquake and tsunami from around 1700. There was tale of massive eagle that stole babies in Maori legend. Pākehā, European settlers, didn't believe it until at least after 1871 when a dude found the 400-plus-year-old remains of an eagle in a swamp. They were 20-33 lb/9-15 kilograms and had a the 8th of May 10 foot/2.4-3 m wingspan. It would hit prey by diving at 50 mph/80 kph toward the neck or head, and the striking force was equivalent to a cinder block falling from the top of an 8-story building. It hunted moa, which were 12 feet 3.7 m tall. It definitely could have stolen a baby. Edit. Despite this not being my highest comment, I only now understand the RIP inbox comments. But an eagle whose remains were 400 years old. NSA spying on literally everyone all the time. COINTELPRO and MKUltra might fit into the same category. MKUltra definitely does. Oh, the government is controlling our minds. Okay dude. Years later. Oh duck, the government drugged a load of people to try to control their minds. Machu Picchu. Bullshit. Turns out. Yes, Mr. Conquistador. There was. Giant redwood trees were thought to be a hoax by a great many people back in the day. Where did they think the massive wood came from? Viagra. Gorillas were believed to be mythical. Kind of like Bigfoot. I seem to recall there was a while that the Greeks considered them to be an advanced civilization that spoke and had buildings. That must have been before Gorilla City developed their cloaking technology. I've mentioned this before in a similar thread, but I'm seriously surprised no one's mentioned the Green Man yet. Wikipedia.org. Basically, people thought they were seeing a ghost on a certain road. And it turned out to be a person out on night walks who was heavily mutilated as a child due to an electrical accident. In Paris they would mine limestone in near darkness. They only had a green light to help them out. Sometimes the oxygen would run out and people would hallucinate and see other people with their green lights coming for them. When they got out, they'd be sure they saw a green man chasing them. In reality, it was other miners trying to get out of the mines. Source: my tour guide The Paris Catacombs. It wasn't clear whether King Richard III was really deformed, or if people who wrote about him after he died were just making it up. Some people thought he must have been physically normal, but writers added the deformity to make him seem more hateable. When his remains were found, there was evidence of severe scoliosis that would have made one shoulder higher than the other. Not a hunchback, but at least a bit lopsided. Lots of animals and things from other continents. Narwhals, platypuses, and manatees come to mind. The utterly absurd and wildly implausible rumors of high-profile British celebrities and politicians being involved in some weird paedophile ring of child sexual abuse. This wasn't helped by the fact that the rumors first came from none other than that paragon of rational thought, Mr. David Icke, Ted Heath, allegedly, Cyril Smith, Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris, Stuart Hall, Fred Talbot, Gary Glitter. The discovery of Viking Norse colony at Ellensorks Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada that was settled between 990-1050. Rumors of Norse landings in North America were dubious, often alluded to in the Icelandic or Greenlander sagas as the colony of Vinland. In 1961, a colony was located, excavated and dated to over 400 years prior to Columbus. For a few hundred years the Micronesians, a Stone Age culture, had the fastest sailboats in the world. The first few reports of how fast the boats went were derided as fantasy. It wasn't until George Jensen made actual measurements and drawings in the 1740s it was taken seriously. The Shang Dynasty, China's second dynasty according to traditional historiography. Until the 20th century, there was no direct evidence that it had existed besides records describing it left behind by dynasties that came centuries after them. And it was ascribed semi-mythical status. Then one day somebody realized that dragon bones being ground up by a bunch of villagers to make medicines were actually oracle bones. The first direct written evidence of the Shang dynasty's existence left by the dynasty itself. The dynasty preceding the Shang, the Xia dynasty, is still considered mythical, and since it precedes writing its existence is harder to verify. Edit. Archaeologists have however recently found evidence of a massive flood on the Yellow River 4,000 years ago that has been suggested to correspond with the Great Flood of the Xia dynasty's founding myth. Kangaroos were once classified as cryptids, along with Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, etc. Before it was established that they kept their babies in their pouches. It was told that they were creatures with two heads. Makes me think what other cryptids we actually are just seeing wrong. That one scene from the Newlywed Game where the question was ladies, where is the weirdest place you've ever gotten the urge to make whoopee? To which one of the contestants replied, in the as. The host, Bob Eubanks, even insisted for years that it never happened. But then a clip emerged. One of my favorites is Lake Nass in the Republic of Cameroon. The local legend was that an evil spirit or a monster lived in the lake and would come out at night to kill anyone who lived too close to the lake. One of the local groups, the Bafman, settled in the high ground near the lake due to the legends. Different groups moved into the area in the mid-1900s and lived closer to the water's edge, disregarding the customs of the Bafman. In 1986, nearly 1,500 people living near the lake were found dead. Those who lived in the higher ground were fine. It turns out the lake was very deep and would essentially become carbonated. A landslide could trigger a release of CO2 from the lake waters. On that night in 1986, an enormous release occurred, and since CO2 is heavier than air, anyone in the lower area simply suffocated and didn't wake up. So while the myth about the evil spirits wasn't entirely true, there really was something in the lake to fear. Rogue waves. Watch is a very good documentary on this. They thought they solved the mystery about 3 times and then knew massive waves would wreck a cargo ship and they would be back to drawing board. All the shopping routes used today have been revised to avoid rouge waves. Edit. Got a few messages looking for a link. Yow to be enjoy. North Korean kidnappings of some Japanese people. They were just rumors and a myth for a while. But then NK came out and admitted that they totally did it. Wikipedia.org. Cropsey. I remember him being brought up in a thread many years ago in the early days of Something Awful. In a What's a Local Scary Thing for You? Thread. Was just a spooky myth about a spooky boogeyman who lived in the steam tunnels under CUNY Staten Island and Willowbrook State School. Who kidnapped, abused, and murdered little kids. Turns out he was a real dude called Ray Rand who kidnapped and murdered an estimated 5 children and special needs adults over a period of 12 years in the 70s and 80s. He had been in prison since 1988 for kidnapping, but came back into the spotlight in 2004 when he was brought to trial and convicted for a second kidnapping. NY state lacks a statute of limitations on kidnapping. In 2009, a documentary, from what I understand it is very sensational and plays up the supernatural Satan worship scare angle, called Cropsey was released. The DNC was actively working against a popular candidate from getting nominated. If you look at the whole election, the Republicans were way more egalitarian than the Dems. The Republicans had tons of people running whereas the Dems had 2 people no one knew. A socialist dinosaur. And literally the sketchiest politician they could find. Rob Ford, Toronto mayor, smoking crack. When this rumor broke, most people just thought it was a dumb rumor. Given his character, it seems like the kind of thing somebody would invent or overzealously stretch evidence to attempt to make real. Even people that didn't like him, many people, didn't give this any credit. Then the video surfaced and the admissions came and it was surreal. The Club Penguin iceberg actually tipped. For a long time it wasn't possible though. They just decided to make it tip before they closed everything down. I feel like dragons were born out of early human civilizations finding dinosaur bones. In that respect, dragons did exist. Cyclops were made up after seeing a skull of an elephant. The hobbits of Flores. The local people had an oral tradition of stories about these little people. It was considered to be a myth or a legend, until the bones were found. Interestingly, the locals had stories of the hobbits up until the 19th century. Presumably these later stories are myths, because we never found bones that recent. But what if? For those who may misunderstand, the Flores men are an extinct species of human noted for their short, hobbit-like size that lived on the Indonesian island of Flores somewhere between 50 to 200,000 years ago, possibly even more recently. And I honestly kind of wish the stories of them existing up to or even beyond the 19th century were true. Prion diseases like mad cow and fatal familial insomnia and Kuru. They are caused by a protein malformation and yet are communicable, which was thought to be impossible by epidemiologists. And yet here we are with prion diseases caused by genetics, fatal familial insomnia, by consumption of brain tissue, mad cow, Creutzfeldt Jakob, Kuru, and now by pathogen, chronic wasting disease. The case was essentially cracked in part by a teenager in Italy. The scientist who first made the discovery in Papua New Guinea was a pedophile, so he was discredited, which is part of why it took so long. There's a fascinating book called The Family That Couldn't Sleep, I think, that traces the history and the science behind prions. The Living Islands. A group of sailors land and explore a new island, one they have never seen before, in an area they know well. It is covered with ancient waterlogged trees and the corpses of unknown eldritch creatures. Spanning 100 or so meters, the isle appeared to have risen overnight. During the night they light a fire from driftwood. Moments later the great beast upon whose back they now rested gives a great fiery roar and dives beneath the waves as they scurry back to their ship, which is nearly pulled down by the anchor. There are versions of this from the Mediterranean, the Western Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Despite the strange co-occurrence of the thousands of years old myth, everyone thought this was a completely baseless until a island rose from the depths outside Pakistan a few years ago, floating on a cushion of methane. Some hapless locals go aboard, light a few of the vents, and lo and behold, the island roared fire until it sank a few days later. Sure, it's not alive by today's standards, but that seems like a fair guess by the ancient sailors who probably spent the rest of their lives trying to tell people. The tranquil lake. The locals in a region of Africa repeatedly told European settlers that a particular lake was cursed. It had been holy to some old tribe whose god got angry and slew them all. There was nothing strange about the lake itself, except that it didn't contain the usual fish. Settlement and forced resettlement began shortly. Better part of a century later, the curse struck and the village was completely wiped out. The local populace, most of their cattle, and nearly all smaller life died. The deaths of every insect, bird and beast of the jungle within miles made for the eerie silence which had given the lake its name in ages past. Hundreds had died. The survivors, shaken to their very core, whispered of demons and the stank of brimstone. The dead appeared to have died without wounds or signs of disease. Later the local priest spoke of how the lake had turned blood red and remained so for weeks. Beyond religion, no one knew what had happened, and after a time, the rest of the world concluded the tall tales of the deadly red lake must have been bullshit. That changed with the Lake Mars disaster a century later. Edit fixed grammar and converted a crap translation to a slightly better one. Wasn't there that surface iron deposit in South America, Argentina, where the makes claimed it came from the sky in a fiery fashion? It turns out it is a meteor crater, huge meteorite. Feel to Earth like 1000 BC as modern science reveals. Fact remembered in collective memory, mythology, for 2000 plus years. Panda bears. Nobody used to believe they existed because those who found them had to go so far to do so and weren't guaranteed a spotting. Jefferson didn't believe meteorites could be from the sky's heavens. He wrote a letter questioning how stones got into the clouds. He was president. The letter was written in 1808. Dexter's root removal. Everyone used to think it was some sort of urban myth for over a decade, until Adult Swim actually went ahead and released it in 2013. I think it even aired on TV a couple of days ago. Room 641A. It's a room inside an 8-tank telecommunications backbone that was rumored to house beam splitters to monitor all internet traffic in the United States. Once Prism was released, it was insane how accurate the conspiracy theories were. Wikipedia.org. The Home Kiem turtle was a legendary creature living in Home Kiem Lake in Vietnam. In the 15th century, the golden turtle god Kim Ki appeared to the emperor of Vietnam and gave him a sword. After a war with the Chinese, the turtle reappeared and took back the sword. Sightings of the mythical turtle persisted on and off for hundreds of years until in 1967 a fisherman actually found or caught the turtle and beat it to death with a crowbar. Multiple sightings since then confirmed the turtle or turtles in the lake are very similar to or possible the same creature as the Yangtze giant softshell turtle. Zebra donkeys are the classic example of cryptids that turned out to exist, and many people use them to hold on to their hopes that Bigfoot is real. Not quite a myth, but Jonathan Swift wrote in Gulliver's Travels, 1726, about Mars having two moons about 150 years before they were discovered, in 1877. He got their distances from Mars and orbital periods not ridiculously wrong either. Pompeii was rediscovered by a Spanish engineer in 1748, some 1,600 years after the volcano eruption destroyed it. In the 1960s there were rumors that the US government had been carrying out secret germ warfare tests on its own citizens. These rumors were strongly denied. Then in the 1970s, when pressed by Senate hearings, the military admitted that, between 1949 and 1969, such tests had taken place, most notably on the New York subway system.